Hello and welcome to Let's Talk Azure podcast with your hosts Sam Foote.
And Armstrong.
If you're new here, we're a pair of Azure and Microsoft 365 focused IT security professionals. It's episode 5 of season 5. Alan and I had a discussion around the updates to Azure in January. Here are a few things that we covered. Security product updates covering Defender XDR, Defender for Cloud Apps, and Defender for Identity. And many new updates to Azure, from new public and private previews as well as general availability launches. We've noticed that a large number of you aren't subscribed. If you do enjoy our podcast, please do consider subscribing. It would mean a lot to us for you to show support to the show. It's a really great episode, so let's jump in. Hey Alan, how are you doing this week?
Hey Sam, not doing too bad. How are you?
Yeah, good, thank you. I've got to make an apology for our last week's episode because I think unintentionally, I believe it was unintentionally, completely cut Alan's audio out of the podcast episode. So yeah, apologies for that, Alan.
That's okay. I had a couple of people message me, so
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you
yeah.
anybody that did get in contact with us. I I promise it was an accident. I uploaded the wrong file. Because we have two separate files, one with my audio in it, one with Alan's audio in it, and a combined one. And yeah, and I uploaded my one. So yeah, it was. I must admit, last week's episode was recorded quite late because it was edited quite late because we had an issue with our recording provider. I had to get them to re-export. I think it was my audio or your audio. I can't remember. One of ours didn't process properly, so I ended up actually editing the episode quite late at night, and yeah, I must have just hit the wrong upload basically. So yeah, apologies. That shouldn't happen again.
No, it's all right. It was. I mean, considering what we're on, like 70, 80 episodes now. One small hiccup on an episode's not too bad, is it?
Yeah, no, to be fair,
Really?
actually, I was thinking my first thought was to like, what process can we change? How can we change it? And then I sort of thought, yeah, it's the first time I've clicked the wrong thing, basically. So
Yeah,
yeah.
we've done 81 episodes, and we haven't generally had a problem. So
No, it's
we're not
usually
that.
been around recording, hasn't it? Right?
Yeah, I was gonna say not that the listeners would know about issues, sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because most of them happen way before we get to editing the episode. That's for sure. So, no, touch wood, we're quite consistent now. So, yeah, fingers crossed that continues on. Should we just jump into topics, Alan? Because I think we've got. It seems like Microsoft have been quite busy uh, in January, considering we also did a news sort of update up to I think about the 8th or so, 7th or 8th of January. So in theory, we've only got 3 weeks worth of updates, but it feels like they've awoken from their holidays and we've got a lot to talk about.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if I sort of start on sort of the ones I've got around the security products, these are really sort of general availability announcements around Defender XDR. So you've got the new, I say new, it's probably been there for quite some time now, but the unified role-based access control across the whole of the the XDR sort of solution. So Defender for Identity, Defender for Endpoint, and the others. In effect, uh, bringing the RBAC out of the individual products and then bring it into the whole sort of suite. So you can create roles across that span across multiple products there. That's really good. And then the other one, which got announced, I think at Ignite, and it's already sort of GA now, is getting Defender Cloud alerts into Defender XDR. So just sort of hooking it up, doing a bit of a connection or permissions more than anything, and then you can see them in one place. So it's just bringing everything into Defender for XDR. So some nice easy ones there. For Defender for Cloud Apps, MDA, the SaaS security posture management has had some upgrades in that now it has more applications. So it was only Google and Salesforce, I think it was, and maybe a few others. It's now things like in preview at least, it's Dropbox, Workplace, Zendesk, and things like that. So there's a couple more in there, so that's really good. So now you can see your posture of those SaaS applications. And that's really just been growing on itself. And any recommendations that are in there feed into your secure score. So if you do enable them, just be prepared for maybe a small drop in that score. Because
Communicating your secure score drop to
yeah,
your less technical stakeholders. Yeah.
yes, yeah. Why is it dropped by 10%? Oh, it's because we've added more functionality or more points to get.
Well, we see the true the true visibility, right? It's not just covered up.
Yeah. Okay, so probably the next one for me is Defender for Identity. So not necessarily an upgrade to the product itself, but Microsoft and probably the wider community has brought out some PowerShell to help configure the environment. So this is not just to sort of, because there's some extra bits, whilst Defender for Identity just in effect needs an agent to then pull the data into the service. There's various other configuration to allow to get more get the right data to the agent, and a few other configurations. So this is to kind of help that part of it, to do some testing, make sure you can connect to the service, make sure your firewall rules are in place, and things like that. So it's all well documented, and I think it'll be very useful for not necessarily simple, but there's some very complex Active Directories out there. You still might need a bit more sort of guidance. It may be able to help with some parts, but I expect there's a lot of I think it's going to be things with like cross forests and cross domains trusts and things like that's going to be the sticking point for some of that. And then finally from me, as I whiz through these, is Defender for Cloud. And in effect, one thing they've brought in, it kind of ties into Defender for Endpoint actually, is that they've brought agentless malware detection on Azure virtual machines, AWS EC2s, and GCP VM instances. That's part of the Defender for Server Plan 2. So this is kind of to complement Defender for Endpoint agent being installed. But I guess one not necessarily issue, but one concern to a lot of organizations is being able to set scans of the OS, file scans, things like that, and it causing a load on the compute, not being able to then maybe have disruptions in your services. So this is in effect taking that sort of pain away. In effect, I expect it's like the vulnerability scanning, the agentless version. This might be where it takes a snapshot of the disk and then in effect scans it offline to see if there is any malware on there. Any alerts that get created go into Defender for Cloud, but also into the Defender XDR portal. So it's as if it was Defender for Endpoint. It will be still the engine of Defender for Endpoint, just being scanned offline. So I think that's a great win for those workloads or those services that are compute sensitive. That you can do it all offline. You have to worry about a service going or being disrupted at least.
Yeah, and I think it shifts the ability for like InfoSec to apply certain controls with less involvement of like infrastructure, and owners of resources, right? Because if it's completely outside of the of the resource, and there is literally no impact to that resource, then
Why
and it's
not?
agentless, so there's not that configuration step that you've got to go through, because that's some of the blockers that we sometimes bump into, right? Is organizations have the best intent and will to roll out different, I'll call it out, like Defender for Endpoint on Linux servers as an example, right? Or servers that are very like performance sensitive, you know, you know, they're just two examples of many other examples of where a an infosec control can be delayed by legitimate infrastructure and application related concerns about any type of X technology, right? So if you can approach it in an agentless manner, um, you've got a lot more power to sort of make those changes and make them a bit more efficiently.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's not just Azure; it's AWS and GCP as well, which is
Yeah,
great news,
yeah,
especially for straight away kind of scenario, because we know that Azure is well, Azure tends to be first because it's first party, but this seems like it's straight out the door to the other clouds as well, which is
Uh,
great
will this all be at Arc then, based
for
for those other
y- yeah,
for
yeah. I
the
mean,
other clouds?
for the other clouds, I don't think this covers on-prem agent scanning,
Okay.
because that will be a bit of a I don't know how that would work. It's an
No, I
interesting
don't know.
one,
Yeah.
but yeah. So I guess if they were hypervisors, maybe there could be a plugin for that sort of thing to make a snapshot. But
Yeah.
obviously for physical, that'd be a bit of an interesting
How that
one.
works. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so that's kind of a whistle-stop tour of kind of the security stuff I've seen. The only other thing really to mention that was maybe last week or the week before, I can't remember, but was the Microsoft 365 Copilot being the licensing restrictions being removed from the 250 minimum. We've seen a lot of customers already just in effect just taking that on as soon as it got released that way. So yeah, that's probably it from me. What about you,
Yeah,
Sam?
because 365 Copilot was like a massive investment, wasn't it, up front,
Mm,
basically? Because didn't it basically work out to about $100,000? I can't remember if it's 100,000 or $300,000 or something like that. Because was it 300 seat minimum, £250, something like that, or 250?
250. It was 250 because that was in effect the where it goes into enterprise customer E series licensing, and it was $30, wasn't it?
Like $75,000 or something.
Let me just work it out. If I can actually calculate.
No pressure, Alan.
Oh,
Calculator's good.
7,500 a month dollars. That is minimum.
It's what, $80,000 a year,
Yeah,
something like that. $85,000 a year.
90.
90,000. Okay, there you go. So that's quite an investment to make in productivity, right? For any organization. I think
If
we really struggle to validate it because of that, because the use cases for that productivity are so unique to each organization. It's quite hard to get them on board. I don't know of any incentives Microsoft had for people to try that. As far as I'm aware, there wasn't a trial, or you couldn't. You had to sort of jump into it. I don't know if you could have. There were any deals directly with Microsoft that weren't documented that ever happened. Obviously, I'm not really aware of anything. So now you can just buy. I think you got to buy a year up front though, don't you, for each user? You can't license it
Yeah, I think it's got to be a
monthly.
year commit, but
A year commit, but minimum of one. So you could just buy it for a handful of people, and that's what we've seen, haven't we? Of people just you know uh, getting people. Yeah, we should probably talk about Defender for cloud apps actually quickly. And organizations identifying other GPTs and LLMs being used in their organization. That gives them the visibility. But now they've also got a way to switch out those other third party systems to something that's a bit more closer to home.
yeah, exactly. And I think I mentioned it in previous sort of episodes that they brought it in, but the cloud discovery, if you're using that, they've got the new generative AI categories or
Yeah,
category. There's quite a few on that list. I can't remember the exact number. I think it was something like four. I feel like it's like 400 they've got in the list, something like that.
there's a
It seems,
significant number of them. Yeah, in the
but
hundreds. Yeah.
yeah, you can just start seeing if if your users are starting to consume that, which everyone we believe they are. And that might be okay for the organization, but it's just working out how much data as well is going there, so you can understand if someone is doing it
Yeah,
a
exactly.
lot
Yeah,
and there's potential sensitive data.
yeah.
So it's one way to view it, and then maybe it's, hey, stop using that, and here's a license. And
Yeah, because we don't want to block that AI productivity gain, right? If people
no,
actually use it and they use it in their day to day, let's make sure we embrace that productivity change. Let's just make sure it's done in the controlled way that we want to, So and yeah, and the fact that it also works on your own organization's data is hopefully going to even give you even more, um, ability, and the integration is just generally better. So.
yeah, and probably with that drop in licensing has been really good as well, because your ROI is better, because at least you can work out the how you control the access to the data and things like that, because you only need a couple of licenses to try it out, where
Yeah,
beforehand
exactly. Yeah, yeah,
you'd have
yeah,
250 and you probably only give it to 3 or 4.
exactly.
IT work out
Whilst you're
how to
testing
lock
it,
it
yeah,
down.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like we're going to
So
pilot it internally for 5 people for 3 months, to see how it goes, which is probably fair, like a fair thing to do. Or what, insert your own time frames and numbers, for
mm,
whatever. Um, but as far as I understand, and I could be wrong, is that you had to commit to, as you say, 250 people to run your pilot for 3 months. So you just got 200, or you just give it to everybody and
hope for
chocks
the best.
away.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys. So yeah, no, it's really it's really good to see from Microsoft doing that.
Cool. Yeah. So what's yours then, Sam? What news have you got from Azure?
Okay, so on the Azure side, we have a new public preview of a new product called Azure API Center. Now, Azure API Center is used to inventory and manage your organization's APIs. Now, I know the question you're going to ask in a second, Alan, and I will get onto that. But so basically, it allows you to. It doesn't. It's sort of platform agnostic, so it can be used with any APIs. And imagine this is just a centralized place to store the schema and information about each of your APIs. Now, you know this is a challenge with organizations that builds microservices, have lots of APIs internally. They might provide them for their customers. um, just understanding what capability you've got in your organization and managing that documentation wise, it is a challenge. So this is what it's really um, aimed at. Now the question is how is that any different to Azure API Management? Because Azure API Management has its own ability to, I suppose, document and inventory your APIs. Um, but what API Management does is it puts a layer um, in front of your APIs to effectively proxy those APIs. You build backends which interface with your APIs. So API Center doesn't have any of that. It just has the documentation part of it. So there is sort of a complementary overlap, so to speak, but it really is a completely sort of
So
segregated and standalone product. You don't have to use API management to use it. So yeah,
this kind of sounds like an upgrade to the, is it the developer portal in the API manager?
yes, yeah, exactly, yeah.
So
Yeah,
that
but
all makes sense. Yeah.
I haven't fired it up yet.
Mm.
I think we should definitely do an episode on it. But what they're describing is that it's basic metadata and information about your APIs. So like I assume just schemas, um, X, Y, Z. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see. Um, that's in preview at the moment. I don't know pricing. Be interesting to see what happens there.
No, that's cool.
Yeah, there's also the feedback is being taken on a Git repo as well, which I thought was pretty interesting. So for that, so there's quite a few people testing that. Azure Container Apps allows you to now expose accept TCP connections on multiple ports. So I believe before it was just like HTTP, HTTPS, TCP, but apparently that's been expanded to more um, ports. So I assume that's for other load balancer type scenario settings, and I believe there's a big part about VNet integration as well. So I'm guessing it might be a microservice change as well. So uh, I don't know how big the engineering for that is, but that feels like quite a small change. But yeah, I don't want to call that out too much. Um, Next one for me, which I think is pretty awesome. This one is there's an Azure SQL trigger for Azure Functions now. So like you've been able to do in things like storage accounts, table storage, X, Y, or Z. You've been able to trigger on new rows of data being added. There is now a trigger in for Azure SQL. It uses SQL tracking functionality, change tracking functionality, and whenever a row is created, updated, or deleted, you can have a function trigger basically. So yeah, that looks pretty cool. Currently in preview, which is good to see. Um, Going back to APIs, Azure API Management now has what's called a circuit breaker. Um, a circuit breaker is a property that you add onto your backend resource. It's essentially to protect it from being overwhelmed by too many requests. Um, so if you imagine, you can define a condition which is a certain amount of requests hit your API over a certain time period, and what that could then do is it can trip that circuit breaker, and then effectively for a certain amount of time, it can return like a 503 service unavailable. So you've effectively got a um, it's not DDoS, but an anti like sort of flood breaker inside that. And as I sort of mentioned before, API management is giving you sort of a reverse proxy front end to your APIs, so you can sort of protect, because your APIs that are sort of behind API management might be legacy APIs. They could be on-prem API, they could be anything basically. So this gives you the ability to add some of that protection where you may have less, because um, you know, if your API management is in front of like an Azure function or an Azure app service, a lot of that nowadays is very flexible in how much it can spin up, scale and sort of retract. But if you're fronting um, like an IaaS box or maybe an on-prem resource with API management, you could potentially get overwhelmed because you might not have that scalability. Um, so it's there are already rate limit and concurrency limits um, uh, inside of API management. This just takes this to basically to another level, and gives you some ability to decide what happens when those are hit.
That's good because I guess as well, even though some of those other services can spin up resource, you may not want to incur too much of a cost. It might be a way of
Yeah, 100%.
saying my
Yeah.
max is this kind of
Yep.
thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and you could, it could be the start of some sort of denial of service attack. If if let's say your average, requests are like 100 per minute, and you see 20,000 in a minute, it might be worth just saying, "Whoa, let's hold on a minute," and just um, and trigger that circuit breaker. Um, Another update to Azure API Management in January is what's called a load balanced pool. So what you can do here is you can create a pool which contains multiple backends for an API. So a backend is just literally a backend API that you're sort of fronting with API management. And now you can load balance requests across those backends. So it's effectively like having a load balancer within side of API management. Um, and this is good for splitting load. Obviously, like a load balancer would, um, and that can also be used in conjunction with circuit breakers as well to make sure that you're not hitting a circuit breaker on any one. You can distribute between two to sort of not trigger those. But also, if you want to shift load from one backend resource to be able to deploy a new change to it, let's say you've got a high availability API, maybe it's on two servers as an example, and you want to roll out a new version to it. You could migrate all traffic onto one of those boxes, do your upgrade, migrate all of your traffic over to that box that you've just upgraded, and then do the same for the other box. So it allows you to sort of um, more sophisticated way do those upgrades. So yeah, both circuit breakers and load balance pools are both in preview as we speak. So it'd be interesting
The,
to see. Yeah,
yeah, the back end pool thing is quite interesting because it has really only ever been kind of tied to one. You could do some clever sort of API policy to try and say if this area is getting errors, then go back to the next one. But you couldn't really ever load balance,
yeah,
not not successfully or not very clean. I suppose is
yeah,
the best way of doing it.
yeah. The only thing that kind of I don't know, I've got a bit of a I don't know concern about is I don't know what SKU those things are going to be on, right? Just calling it out there
Well,
because if you're slumming it on the SKUs that we usually use, I'm not sure you're gonna. So,
it's
but we'll see. We'll see. I don't want to call it out. I can't call it out yet. So yeah, but
well, this is an
it's very
effect.
enterprising.
Well, yeah, and also technically, if you could do this, you wouldn't necessarily need a local load balancer or a front
Yeah,
door or TMG traffic manager or anything. Kind of ties it in, so you do feel it's going to be
who
higher up.
knows? Yeah, who knows? um, yeah, so API management, I would say they're quite a good couple of upgrades to API management. Some extra flexibility. One for people that like to live on the edge is the ability to upgrade Gen 1 virtual machines to Gen 2 to take advantage of trusted launch. Um, so it really boils down to Gen 1 VMs use is it fair to say BIOS firmware? Is that the right terminology?
I think,
They use
yeah,
BIOSes, right? I really get confused with like, is UEFI a BIOS? It kind of is. I don't know. So they use what we refer to as BIOS as their firmware, how the machine is launched and managed. Um, Gen 2 trusted launch requires UEFI virtual machines. So it's going to be very interesting to see what that upgrade process looks like. Because personally, for me, I have never converted a machine that is a BIOS machine to UEFI. Conversely, for a long time, I've only ever exclusively used UEFI. So I assume these workloads are relatively old or SKUs that require Gen 1,
I
so
think
it'd be interesting
I
to see
think
how that
Gen
works.
2 has only been, it's only been out for a year or maybe 2 years officially. I think there's
Right,
still quite a
okay.
load of workloads
There
will have
must
been in that. So
this seems like a big thing to me because if you require trusted launch, if you want that level of certainty without having to rebuild your environments, right? Because if we're talking about switching from you know, BIOS to UEFI, to me that's a rebuild, isn't it? Right? That's not a you press a button and you just convert across. So that's why I sort of prefaced it with people that like to live on the edge, because this one sounds scary but awesome at the same time if they can pull it off. Um, there, it, it's interesting because they call it a private preview on the Azure update list, and then it links to the form. Whenever you sign up to a private preview, there's always a Microsoft form that you've got to fill out to sort of opt into it. And they're linking from the public Azure updates feed to a private preview. So to me, it's not really that private because it's publicly available. So,
Y-
um, so,
yeah.
but I assume that there's not. I assume they're going to. I don't know. Maybe there's some motivated people out there, but they're going to struggle with getting the numbers of people to opt into this type of testing, right? Because it sounds scary to me. But I suppose it's non-production anyway. You'd have to do all your dev environments.
Yeah, I mean the announcement of it being private preview is and telling you some information about it. Everyone kind of probably understands what it's doing, but how is probably still in the
Yeah, yeah,
non-public.
exactly.
So
Yeah,
yeah, so
yeah,
still, I think they did that. They've done that with the unified Defender XDR, where you can integrate Sentinel. In fact, they've almost pretty much documented it, but you can't get it
yeah,
unless you join the private preview. So, but I think
yeah,
that's probably more
exactly.
of a mechanism for releasing it rather than a actually releasing out to people to test sort of thing. I think it's more of that mechanism for that one. But
Yeah.
no, it's
Um.
cool.
So yeah. So I thought that seems like an interesting one to follow and see where that goes. I'd be
Well,
curious to test that. I don't currently have any BIOS VMs to test it with, but I could create some and join the private preview because it would be interesting to see how that's going to be handled.
I think that's probably coming. Cause I think they're stopping Gen ones, aren't they? I think that's why.
Oh, are they? Right. That makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah.
Um, the last one that I've got is there is now an Azure Arc Visual Studio Code extension for managing deployments of applications to Arc enable workloads. I believe the first supported version is, let me just get the exact name, Connected Kubernetes Clusters. So I believe it's for application management and deployment to connected Kubernetes clusters. Um, I just wanted to make sure I included the word connected because I don't know the difference between a connected and, I assume, disconnected Kubernetes cluster. So um, I don't have any Kubernetes clusters to test this with, so it won't be one that I'm particularly looking at. Um, but it's interesting because I know it's not the same thing, but I do use the Azure Functions Visual Studio Code extension because it makes it incredibly easy to deploy Azure Function apps, because you literally just see your function app, you right click on it, and you go deploy, and it packages it up. It puts it into Azure for you. It can stage it, X, Y, and Z. It is very slick. It's almost easier than actually running a pipeline to deploy them,
And
which is wrong for me to say, really, but it is just so easy because you just right click and go deploy. And I think you can do that with app service as well. So it's interesting to see.
yeah, I wonder if they've got. I mean, because I don't know. I wonder if they've got for Azure Kubernetes, whether you can do it from Visual Studio Code and deploy your application to those clusters. And this is adding it so you can do it on premise or into AWS or
Exactly.
GCP
That's what I
kind of
think. Yeah.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's what they mean by connected Kubernetes clusters. Um, it's interesting to me that it's a separate add-on extension. Sorry. Um, why wouldn't it just be included with the Azure
It
tools?
it,
So
it might be because it's preview, so they're just doing it separately first
fair,
and then
fair,
throw
fair.
it
Yeah,
in.
yeah. No, that makes sense. Um, so yeah. Yeah, that's going to be interesting to see um, what happens with that extension. Um, yeah, that's it for me. The only thing to call out with that extension, it seems like it's been there for a while. I don't know if it's been in like private preview, and now it's public because the last update to it, the last commit in uh the last version was in October. So I wonder if it's just actually gone like public preview now. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, maybe.
So yeah, that's it from me.
Cool. Yeah, some of those were definitely interesting. So I'm definitely interested in that Gen 1 to Gen 2. I'm never probably ever going to need to use it, but I am
I'd
interested.
be very intrigued to see how that goes. Yeah, exactly. What the rollback strategy is. I would really want to be on those private preview calls of like when they're talking about the people asking questions. I just feel like alarm bells are going to be,
Yeah,
yeah,
I'm pretty sure you got to change the bootloader part of the
exactly.
OS.
Yeah,
So, but then
yeah.
Microsoft technically managed that. So in the Azure VM, so maybe it's
So
just
yeah, don't
that
know.
easy. I don't know.
Who knows? Who knows? It's probably worth just calling out these are only our highlights. There are many, many, many
Yeah,
more. And apologies if your workload wasn't covered. We just picked the things that we think we think are cool, basically, because there's just so much that you could potentially talk about. It's
yeah,
probably worth just calling out that we are going to do one of these news episodes every month. Um, the reason being is that it's nice to have a way to sort of absorb new updates and get a snapshot of them on a sort of regular cadence. Um, and it's also a way for Alan and I to discuss these updates together, which is the whole reason for this podcast, basically. So yeah, it's a good way. So we're gonna sort of dedicate one episode a month just to do a snapshot of the things that we feel are important.
yeah. We're always talking about, aren't we, the things that have come out. We're like, oh, we better do an episode on that, and then it's by the time we scheduled it, it's like 3 or 4 weeks, 5 weeks away, isn't it, or something? So
Yeah, yeah,
just worth
exactly.
getting sight of it at least to get people looking into those new features, because a lot of the time people don't listeners, people don't know about any of it happening because it's just so
No,
rapid.
I don't. And a lot of these things, I obviously check the Azure update list quite regularly, because of the podcast. To be totally honest with you, I'm checking it. I got a reminder to get me to check it every week to see what's happened each week. Because before I talk about it, even if I'm not going to test it, I need to. I want to read through, understand each one of the topics as much as I can. So um, but before that, I didn't used to really look at it. And you can just be pigeonholed into whatever you're doing, and there's been like 3 or 4 updates in a certain area, and then you most of the time you're just missing out on functionality that you didn't even know existed, or a new technology, or a new solution to your problem, right? So it's worth keeping on top of, but it can be pretty overwhelming because we're only really talking about Azure. There's many other different things that Microsoft updates on a daily basis.
Yeah, Teams, things like that. All the productivity stuff. I mean, that's
Modern
another world.
work, yeah. We don't really, well, yeah, yeah, loads of stuff. Operating systems, X, Y, and Z. Oh, so much stuff.
Cool. Okay, so what's our next episode then, Sam?
So, next episode is going to be Azure AI Studio. It's currently in preview. I've been um, playing with it, so to speak, to see what the sort of hype um, is all about, to see what I can create with it. So I'm going to take us through that, and yeah, we're going to deep dive some of the functionality there to see if it's what the answer that I'm trying to get to is that what is the actual like applicable value, to actually using the studioing, and yeah, and how it interfaces with other sort of model ecosystems as well.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds good. Sounds like it sort of integrates some of the. Don't know if it can integrate some of the Copilot stuff you can do, but I guess we'll find out.
We'll find out next week.
Cool. Okay, so did you enjoy this episode? If so, please do consider leaving us a review on Apple or Spotify. This really helps us to reach out to more people like you. If you have any specific feedback or suggestions, we'd like to hear them. There's a link in our show notes to get in contact with us.
Yeah, and if you've made it this far, thanks ever so much for listening, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Yeah, thanks all.